industrialisation isn't about textiles, and it isn't about factories, and it isn't about spinning machines. It's really about this much more fundamental transformation in the way in which we do things. So we all have a few preconceptions about what industrial revolution is, maybe some memories of how it was taught to us at school. But in fact, it's really quite a complex concept, and it takes a bit of time, or it's worth unpacking a little bit what exactly we mean by the term industrial revolution. So we tend to think industrial revolution is all about technology and new machines and factories. And I think that's absolutely true. Of course, these things are all involved in the industrial revolution. But for me, that doesn't really get to the heart of what we mean by industrialisation. And there are more helpful ways of thinking about what this change really involves. In order to really get to the bottom of that, it's worth thinking about what the world was like, or what countries were like before they industrialised. So industrialisation really is about changing the ways in which we make things, about the process of manufacture. And all societies, even very simple, primitive societies, make some things. They make some clothes and some footwear and some forms of housing, and this is all what we call manufacture. So it's always existed, but industrialisation is really a revolution in the way in which things are manufactured. So if we think about how in Britain, for example, we made our clothes before the Industrial Revolution, we tended to make our clothes from things like flax, and we'd make linen clothes, and from wool. And the sheep and the linen grew locally, and we took it out of the local environment. We manufactured it fairly simply by hand, and then we had clothes that we could wear. And that's really how societies across the world have done their manufacturing. They took things that were locally available, they've transformed them into something that was more useful to them, and then they used them. Of course, there was a bit of buying and selling in all of this as well. When the Industrial Revolution happened, there was a really remarkable change in the process of manufacture. So we all know that cotton and the factory is where the Industrial Revolution all began in Britain. But if we think about what's going on there, it's more than simply the factories. There's something underpinning that that's really different as well. And that is the fact that we're now making our clothes out of cotton. And cotton, of course, doesn't grow locally in Britain at all. That cotton had to be grown elsewhere and shipped thousands of miles into Britain before it could be made into useful clothes. And that's just part of the story, because what was also happening with Industrial Revolution and technology and the factories and all the things that we know about is we were starting to make much more cotton cloth than British people really needed. We had far too much stuff. We were manufacturing much more than was needed by the population. So of course what we were doing was putting all of these cotton cloth that we'd manufactured back onto the ships and sending it all the way across the globe so that it could be bought by people in very distant places. So what's really happening here with industrialisation is a rupture in the way in which things are being made and manufactured. So no longer are societies taking what's local, turning it into the things they need, and then using them for themselves. They're getting materials from very distant parts of the globe sometimes. They're getting much more than they need. They're using modern technology to make the goods that they want, and then they're selling them on the global market. So for me, that's a more helpful way of thinking about what's going on with Industrial Revolution. It's nothing less than a complete transformation in the purpose and the means of manufacturing. The textbook example of change in the case of Britain is, of course, the textile industry. As I say, there's this switch from traditional fabrics such as linens and wools to cotton, and a suite of really significant inventions, initially in the spinning industry, but then of course you're starting to spin yarn much more quickly than you can weave the cloth. So then there are a suite of inventions in the weaving industry as well, and in all of the finishing industries as well. These are the examples that are best known, but I think the really interesting thing about the Industrial Revolution, in fact, is there are lots of changes across all sorts of industries as well. So in the shoe industry, in the sewing industry, and the making up of clothes, there's masses of change around the mining industry, the metalworking industries, there's the making of the coal-powered steam engine. I think in some ways the point about the Industrial Revolution is it just spreads very, very quickly from one area to another. So in fact it's much more than the cotton industry. As soon as one industry starts to industrialise, you see similar patterns across many, many other industries, ceramics, paper, I mean, you name it, there will be a suite of technological inventions at this time, and there'll be just changes in the whole process of manufacture. Industrialisation started in Britain, and it was located primarily in the textile industry. And that's led to us thinking that industrial revolutions are all about factories and cotton and spinning, and that's what an industrial revolution is. And I think actually that's a really unhelpful way of thinking about it. Industrialisation did start in Britain, and it was located primarily initially in the textile industry. But industrialisation isn't about textiles, and it isn't about factories, and it isn't about spinning machines. It's really about this much more fundamental transformation in the way in which we do things. And when industrialisation starts to spread to other parts of the world, we see very different technologies predominating and very different changes. So when it moves to Denmark, for example, Denmark does have a textile industry, but industrialisation tends to be located around agriculture and around the dairy industry and butter and milk and cheese and bacon and things like that. This can be industrialised just as in Britain textiles were industrialised. So I think it's much more helpful to step away from the examples of what actually happened in Britain and think more generally about the principles that were underpinning that change. So that's the big arc of change that's going on with the Industrial Revolution, but it's worth drilling down a little bit and thinking a little bit more about when and where this is happening. So I think the thing to really emphasise is obviously it's a very long, drawn-out process. We're not moving very swiftly from very simple peasant societies where all the manufacture was done at home and locally to overnight a much more industrialised way of manufacturing. In fact, it's a change that took over hundreds of years. We know that it happened in Britain first, which is quite unexpected because Britain historically had not really been, or even Europe had not really been the centre of the global economy, but that is where industrialisation starts. And it's at around the middle of the 18th century, the late 18th century, that we start to get the rise of the cotton industry, so all of this cotton that's coming in from other parts of the globe, and of course the machinery, the technology, the factories, these are all emerging in Britain around the 18th century. But I would emphasise that the reason these things are happening in Britain at this time is because Britain had already travelled a really long distance from the traditional society that I was talking about, where people are doing local manufacture for local needs. It's already a very commercial society. There's a lot of trading on the global market. The industries, the textile industries do tend to be wool and they do tend to be linen, but we're buying a lot of wool and a lot of linen from other parts of Europe as well. So we've already got a very kind of commercialised manufacturing system. And it's a very long drawn out change, and industrialisation isn't going to happen until you've gone through a lot of pre-stages where you've already got a commercial, complex and segmented industry in place. But we're looking at Britain in the later 18th century, and of course it very quickly then spreads from Britain to other parts of the Anglophone world, as the US and Australia, New Zealand, but also to parts of continental Europe very quickly, a really very quick domino effect all through the 19th century. To my mind, the Industrial Revolution is really a really significant turning point in world history. For we don't want to flatten out the differences between different parts of the world before industrialisation, because of course medieval China was very different to medieval India, to medieval Belgium, or wherever it is that we're looking at. Of course there were loads of differences between the ways different societies operated and the way they fed themselves and the way they clothed themselves. Obviously it was a complex world. But there was a lot of similarity as well across different parts of the globe, in that most people are making things from their local environment, and for most people throughout human history living standards have been really low because people couldn't really live a life of wealth and abundance on older patterns of manufacture. What happens with the Industrial Revolution is we start making goods in completely different ways, and societies start to grow much, much richer than they've ever done previously. And it spreads very quickly. As I say, it starts in Britain, but it spreads very quickly. So very quickly becomes a kind of a global movement rather than a simply British movement. And it really changes the way in which we live our lives. If we think about how we live our lives today, they're so different to how people were living in the 18th or even in the early 19th century. So for me, it really stands out as a turning point. And we just think about kind of human history before Industrial Revolution. Of course, there were great differences, but there is nonetheless this big kind of pivot in which we move away from more subsistence and more traditional societies into the modern world that we live in today. Industrialisation, or certainly this kind of speeding up of change, occurred in Britain around the 18th century. And some scholars have tried to provide chronologies of the start and ends of industrialisation, or talked about kind of the first industrial revolution, the second and the third. But for me, I think these are really quite unhelpful ways of thinking about what's going on. I tend to think that the industrialisation did start in Europe and the US around the 18th, early 19th century, but it's never really stopped. I think we're still living in a world in which constant change, invention and innovation is normal. It's become our normal, and it's just a switch basically. We've gone from a traditional society to a modern society in which this change is ongoing and never ending. So for me, there's not a succession of different industrial revolutions starting at different times. You either are industrialised or you're not, and we very clearly today are. In the next class, I'm going to drill down a little bit more and think about the causes. What was actually going on in Britain that caused this change to a new industrial world?